To the book of 2Chronicles. We're beginning 2Chronicles rather than 1Chronicles in chronological time. This is August around the 19th of 2017, 2 days before the great eclipse. And reason we are going through 2Chronicles is because we just finished Zechariah, which was the last book of the minor prophets that I had recorded. I recorded all the other minor prophets except Daniel years ago when I first started. And then I did the New Testament, finished the New Testament a couple of months ago. And then the only minor prophet that I hadn't covered in years before when I went through them was Zechariah. It was 14 chapters long, and I postponed it, and then I got excited, went into the New Testament. So I had to finish Zechariah 14, which I just did. Then I figured, well, I may as well finish Daniel also because it ties into the book of Revelation, which I had just finished. Wrote the book, entities of the book of Revelation, and Zechariah had so many things tied into the book of Revelation that I finished it, and then Daniel also, even more so, with episodes attached to the book of Revelation. So then I finished all of that, and I really wanted to go into Isaiah, to the major prophets, and finish Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, finish those because the time I feel is near to, I don't know, you in the future would probably know, but somehow the things that are happening, it was on my heart heavy to go into the major prophets. But I figured to go into the major prophets without really knowing and understanding what happened to bring about the things that they were talking about, you really have to know the history of the kings. Not so much Saul and David, the first two kings, because theirs was different. Saul was chosen, but he went from God's rule, and then God chose David, and the height of the Israel people was started with David and followed into Solomon. But the book of 2Chronicles starts with Solomon. 1Chronicles is mostly David. And so 2Chronicles, we go through it, and we'll see all the things that occurred with basically the kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, Judah, Benjamin, and that is where the temple stood in Jerusalem. And so that all ties in to the prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Now, 2Chronicles, I have two themes basically as we go through to bring out, and we all need to look at these themes because they're interesting for us in our daily lives and the times that we live in. The first theme is the temple. The temple, instituting God's will on earth. God designed the temple starting with back in the days of the tabernacle. And the tabernacle is called the tent. And then the temple was built, and throughout the book of 2Chronicles, the tabernacle is hardly mentioned. It's just at the very beginning. It's torn down, and the temple took its place. And we'll see how people reacted. Basically, the temple deals with the clergy and instituting in God's will what he would have and how man has obeyed God's will. The second theme and the last theme is idolatry. Throughout the book, we'll see the major theme of idolatry, of people doing the opposite of God's will, having idols. These people had actual idols, little three-dimensional statues of various sorts of the gods of the nations that were around them and within Israel itself. In archaeology has found a lot of these little images, clay images that the people were using to worship. Now, how does that affect us? Basically, idolatry ceased. The idolatry that they had ceased after the Babylonian captivity, which will happen at the end of Chronicles. When they were taken to Babylon for 70 years, they returned, and they didn't return to the idols again. They basically went back and started up a new law called the oral law, and we'll go into that later. But the idolatry ceased with the Jews, but idolatry is, we have a lesson in idolatry. It's what is idolatry to us? And as we go through, we'll try to relate to the things that the people were doing to the things that we are doing today. To me, idolatry is very simple, is what do you spend your time with that is not in God's will. Now, to work every day is within God's will, so it's not idolatry to go to work. If you have a family and you're taking care of your family, your wife and your children or your husband, and you're doing the things necessary for them, that's not idolatry. But the things that you spend your time on otherwise, that is not being spent communicating with God in some way. Now, we can't sit and communicate with God 24/7, but we can spend a lot of time reading the Bible and listening to different Bible teachings on the radio or on the TV or the internet, attending a church, being involved with the things of God, helping others. Your ministry could be, doesn't necessarily have to be something that was what you'd call religious. You could be volunteering at a rescue mission, or you could be volunteering in a hospital, volunteering at a job. All these things are within God's will. But if something is taking you away from doing God's will, or me, then that is your idol. And so let's say, as a man, if you are spending all of your time without taking care of your family and doing things with your sons or your daughter, and you're sitting watching NFL football all the time, or NBA basketball, or NBL baseball, and not doing the things, not communicating with God, not reading the Bible, then that's your idol. If you're a woman, and I'm not a woman, so I don't know what women basically do in their time, I would something like maybe if you were thinking about or you're watching soapbox operas all day long, even though you're taking care of your family, if the time could be spent doing the things of God, I'm sure a waste of a time. We all waste our times doing things. I'm the number one time waster, so I'm talking to myself as I'm talking to you. I'm not trying to sit there and put myself up as the ideal person to follow, because I do a lot of these things, and that's why I have such a knowledge of what idolatry is, because I am an idolater. I do spend my time in doing things and watching things and listening to things that I shouldn't. And idolatry can also be if you're living for money. This is what's the most important thing to you, and the things of God don't take second place to money. If you're hooked into pornography or something like that, then in taking you away from the things that you should be doing with your family, your wife, and so forth, then that's idolatry. If you're hooked into gambling, going to the casinos, then that's taking you away from God. That is idolatry. And the list goes on and on. But that's the themes that we are going to bring out in this book of 2 Chronicles. The temple, instituting God's will, and idolatry, basically instituting the devil's will, Satan's will. Chapter 1 begins with Solomon, and says, "And Solomon, son of David, grew in strength over his kingdom, and the Lord his God was with him, and magnified him in stature." So David, his father, was the king of Israel after Saul, and you can go in reading all of this in 2 Samuel and Kings, 1st and 2nd King, 1 Kings. And David, the famous story of David and Bathsheba, Well, Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, and David saw her bathing on a roof and wanted to have her, and so he called the men and brought her and had relations, and they fell in love or whatever, I suppose. I don't know if you call it love, but they she ended up being pregnant, and Uriah was gone, so Uriah would have known it wasn't his baby, so David had Uriah the Hittite put in the front line of the battle and killed. And then David had the baby. Bathsheba had the baby, but it died early on. And the second child that David and Bathsheba had was Solomon. So Bathsheba is Solomon's mother. And then after this, another son of David, an older son than Solomon, called Absalom, revolted against David, took over the kingdom for a short period of time until he was killed, and David came back. And then David wanted to build the house of God, and that's in 2Chronicles 17, chapter 17, all about wanting to build the house. There was only a tent at the time. It wasn't in Jerusalem. So then David couldn't, God wouldn't allow him, and so David gave charge to Solomon, his son, to build the house in 1 29. It talks about that. And then David died, and another son, an older son, Adonijah, usurped the throne and took it, and that's in 1 Kings 1. But then the high priest and people in the army caused, David hadn't died, I'm sorry. Adonijah took the rule right when David was on his deathbed, basically. But then they came and they told David that Adonijah has taken the kingdom, and David said, well, take Solomon and put the royal robes and trumpet and everything that he's the king, put him on thy throne. And so he did, and so Adonijah fled. Later he was killed, and this is in 1 Kings 1. And most of the history of David is in 2 Samuel. 1 and 2 Kings basically contains the same history as 2 Chronicles here, but it has way more detail, especially with the kings of Israel. And right now, with the Isaiah, the kings of Israel and things that were going on were important, but that would have taken quite a lot longer to go through those, and then Chronicles, so I decided to start here. So once we finish the 2 Chronicles, then we're going to go into Ezra, Nehemiah, then Isaiah, Jeremiah. I'm not sure if I did Ezra, Nehemiah yet. I have to go back and look. But we're going to go into Isaiah, those three major prophets. So now Solomon has now been magnified in stature by God. And Solomon spoke to all Israel, and it was one big, large, not a large kingdom as far as space. It was one kingdom, and Solomon was the king. He spoke to the commanders of the thousands, as heliarchs, and to the commanders of hundreds, ekatontarchos, that's the Greek words, and to the krites, the judges, a critic comes from that word, and to all the rulers before all Israel, to the rulers of the families. So he hits them all. And he went, it says, Solomon went out and all the assembly with him unto the high place in Gibeon, of which the tent of the testimony of God was located. The tent of the testimony was built during the time of Moses, went through the wilderness, and then the ark and the tent were together at that time, and they were all the trappings of the tent were together with the ark, and the Levites carried all of this, and they both crossed over the Jordan River, and the tent was, once it was in Israel, it was set up in Shiloh during the Judges, which was after the time of Moses and Joshua. Joshua, they were moving around. It went around Jericho. And so they eventually built the tent, the tabernacle, which is called in Shiloh. And then apparently later, the tent was moved to Nob, N-O-B, where David and his men went to flee from Saul when Saul was trying to kill him, because they went to, I think it was Abimelech, the high priest, and they had the showbread there, these loaves of bread on the golden table. And so it sounds like that's where they moved the tabernacle, or some of it, to that area. But the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. That was in 1 Samuel 6:1. And it was in Philistia for 7 months. The tent was during Eli's time, and that's when the ark was taken. Eli, his 2 sons were evil, and they were killed when they went to take the ark to the battle. Eli, when they found out they were killed, fell over backwards and died. He was an old man, heavy, and he died. And so the tent went into Philistia for 7 months. And then later the tent was moved. It was in Gibeon. Somehow it ended up in Gibeon, where it mentions here. So, so while this the tent was in Gibeon, David prepared another tent in Jerusalem for the ark. He wanted to move the ark, and the ark wasn't with the tent, the tabernacle, at this time, because when it was returned from Philistia by these a cart with these oxen, they went to Kirjath Jearim, and this is in 1 Samuel 7:1. And when it was in Kirjath Jearim, then David went to take the ark to bring it to Jerusalem, to the tent that he had placed in Jerusalem. And as they were leaving, a man named Uzzah touched he wasn't a Levite. The ark was starting to fall over. He touched it and died. So David was upset, and they ended up putting the ark at Obed-Edom's house. This is in 1 Chronicles 13. Another place he has a different name for him. I think we'll find it here in Chronicles. And so the ark was for a short time at Obed-Edom's house, and then finally in 1 Chronicles 16, David goes and gets the ark from Obed-Edom's house, brings it in to Jerusalem, puts it into the tent that he had, which wasn't the same tent that was in Gibeon. The tabernacle was still in Gibeon. So now we're getting to this period of time. So it says right here, and Solomon went out and all the assembly with him unto the high place in Gibeon. But that's not where the ark was, of which the tent of the testimony of God was located, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, made in the wilderness. But David brought the ark of God from out of the city of Kirjath Jearim, for the place David prepared for it, for he pitched a tent for it in Jerusalem. And the altar of brass, which Bezaleel, son of Uri, son of Hur, made, was there before the tent of the Lord. Now, and that would be in Gibeon. So Bezaleel was a man who was named here. He was the technician that designed all the instruments and the utensils for the tabernacle, the tent. And here we have he was the son of Uri, son of Hur, and if it was in Hebrew, it would be Ben-Hur. If you ever saw the movie Ben-Hur, which is a lot later, it's time of Jesus, here is the Ben-Hur, the name. And so this altar of brass was there, which is where they sacrificed the animals. And Solomon and all the assembly sought by it. So they went to seek the things of God. And Solomon offered there upon the altar of brass in Gibeon before the Lord in the tent of the testimony. And he offered upon it 1,000 whole burnt offerings. That is a lot of animals, 1,000 whole burnt offerings, sheep and oxen, and 1,000. So when it says that he offered them, he didn't himself actually sit there and slaughter them all and do it himself. That means that he officiated, had it done, ordered to be done. Maybe they were his own animals, and had them slaughtered. They were given to eat. There wasn't a complete burning of everything, but they did eat these, the priesthood. And then in that night, it says, God appeared to Solomon. So now Solomon has become one of the few people in the Bible that God actually appears to. God appeared to Adam, and then he appeared to, I'm not sure if he appeared to Noah, I think he did, and then he appeared to Abraham and Lot and different people that God appeared to. It'd be interesting to make a list. If you have time to do that and you want to do that, make a list of the people that God appeared to in the Old Testament and send it to me. I would appreciate that. Save me a little work. And so Solomon was one. And God said to him, ask, what shall I give to you? Wow. Can you imagine God asking if all of a sudden we're sleeping or we see something and God's there? Ask what I should give to you. And so what would you ask God to give to you? What would I ask God to give to me? Well, a lot of people have problems and they want the problem solved. Divorce or a death in a family or a return of the dead child or a money to pay all the bills. And well, the list is endless of things that I would like God to give me. But Solomon said to God, well, you performed with David my patros, paternal comes from that, a great act of kindness, mega is great, and gave me to reign instead of him. Vasilav sasme, basil is part of this word. It always has to do with a king or a reign or a monarch and so forth. We have the basil plant, basilica, all these English derivatives from that. And you gave me reign instead of him as he died. And now, O Lord, Theos, God, theology is a derivative, let your word be trustworthy with David, my patros. For you gave me to reign, Vasilav sasme, over a people, Pauline, Poly, many, vast as the dust of the earth. So David is relating with the things that God has done. It's so great already. Now, give to me wisdom and understanding, and I shall go forth before this people and enter in. So he was knew that he needed to rule these people and do the right thing. Now, so it would be sort of like if God said that, what should I give you? And you said, well, I have a family of 5, if you're a male, a wife and 5 kids. Give me the wisdom and understanding to deal with them. Not necessarily a lot of money or a new house, but it was a spiritual request that Solomon asked. And Jesus mentions that of our prayers to be of the spirit, spiritual requests. Now, a lot of people, it doesn't mean you don't offer things. That's requests can also be something that's not necessarily, it could be a petition for money to take care of your problems. But number one is the spiritual request. And then secondly is a petition for a help in a certain area, I believe. That's part of prayer. And then the other parts would be a supplication where you're asking for help for somebody to heal somebody. And then a prayer of thanksgiving to thank God for what he's done. So here his first thing is a spiritual prayer to deal for. He says, for who shall judge this, your great people? And God said to Solomon, because this happened in your heart, cardiac, and you asked not for Pluton, wealth of things, nor doxon, glory, doxology in the liturgy, the glory, nor the life of the ones detesting you, and you did not ask for many days, you didn't ask for long life, none of these things. Now, it's not necessarily wrong to ask for any of these, but you ask for yourself wisdom and understanding, so as to judge my people upon whom I gave you to reign over it. So, again, here was a spiritual thing that he asked for. I need to turn off my Wi-Fi. I'm making a little bit of noise here. And so you ask for the spiritual things of wisdom and understanding to judge my people upon whom I gave you to reign over it. And the wisdom and the understanding I give to you. And Pluton, wealth. We have the planet Pluto. It means wealthy, wealth. And possessions and doxon, glory, I shall give to you, as did not happen likened unto you among the kings before you, and it will not thus be after you. Now, the kings of the world are just the kings of Israel, probably the kings of Israel. So God is going to add, because his heart was in the right place at this time, that God is going to bless him. So we need to take note of this, that the first thing we need to do is get our motives straight, that we are doing the things first of God. Let's look and say, well, now, what is important in my life? What is the number one thing? What would God want me to do? And he would want me to do get a job and go to work and take care of my family. If I'm a young man, to do godly things, help people, and so forth. The list goes on, as we mentioned earlier. And so then, when God has that, all of a sudden, things start happening. When I became born from above, anothen in the Greek, after believing in the Lord for 13 years, back in the 1960s, and I returned, and I realized that the Word of God was God. Jesus is the Word, the Logos. And so, to translating, ended up with the Greek Bible, and God put it on my heart. And I worked on it for 25 years, and now I'm 70, going to be in my 77th year in a few months, but God has taken care of me well. I'm not a wealthy person, but I have a nice house right on the ocean. I have clothes on my back. I have a nice car that I love. It's not a brand new car. It's an 05, and this is 17, but it's a Honda Element. It has plenty of room. An old person can move really well in it. I don't have to stoop down and get real low and then try to get out of a small car like a sports car. Now I see these old people riding around in a sports car, and when I was a kid, it was only young kids. And I'm expecting to see this a good-looking, handsome guy or a young girl, and then they could drive by, and I see it as somebody that's older than me. It's like, oh, no. So I don't have a sports car. I have a car that God gave me, which I really like. And so God has taken care of me, has given me the things that I need, and I believe God will do the same thing for you. Now, to look for the health and wealth, which some ministries teach, they putting the blessings before the motive, before the spiritual blessings. Now, I'm not saying they all do that. There's, like I said, praying for something, money, or to have something in the house or whatever. I had a friend of mine who received had a Toyota van. Loved the Toyota van, but it was old and fell apart. And the person bought a new Dodge Caravan, and had the Dodge Caravan and didn't like it. And it was a brand new one. Didn't like the things that it had compared to the Toyota. So the person called me up and asked me if I would pray that they could sell the Dodge Caravan and get a new Toyota van. And I said, no, I'm not going to pray for that. I'm going to pray that you'll be satisfied with God has given you. But so our prayers and what we ask are interesting, and that is how God works. I believe we need to put the spiritual before the physical. And Solomon came out of Bama in Gibeon, that means a high place, unto Jerusalem. From the face of the tent, the skenes, a scene comes from that, S-C-E-N-E, a scene, because they were a scene of a play were done in tents in the olden days. A tent of the martyriu, the martyr, a testimony, a witness, and reigned over Israel. So now Solomon has sacrificed, put the emphasis on the spiritual part, although he later leaves it, unfortunately, but at the beginning he starts off right. And Solomon brought together chariots and horsemen. Well, that's interesting. You think, well, that's good. But in Deuteronomy 17:16, the Lord said, furthermore, the king is talking about here, he shall not multiply to himself a cavalry, and nor shall he return the people to Egypt, so that he should not multiply to himself a cavalry. God wanted to do the battle himself, and he didn't want it to be the amount of power that the country had, but yet a lot of things people didn't listen, and they did have chariots and throughout the history in Israel. And right here, there were to him 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen during the period of time when God in Deuteronomy, that would have been back in Moses' times, they did build up a cavalry. The the judges, some of the judges had chariots. And he left them, the horses, in the cities of the chariots with the king in Jerusalem. So these different cities with the chariots and the horses were spread out, but the king himself was in Jerusalem. And the king established silver and gold in Jerusalem as stones, lithos, lithography, or writing on a hard surface, and the kedrus, cedar, you can see where it's almost a transliteration, in Judea as a sycamine tree in the plains in multitude. So this was a type of a bush tree that was there in the plains of Israel, grew all over, sort of like a manzanita, I would suppose, that grows all over Southern California in the higher elevation. So the cedars, the choice cedars, were as the weed trees, basically, in the plains. They were the opposite. They were all over the city. They're building all sorts of buildings, and they built a house. Solomon built himself a house. I can't think of the name of it, but I will probably run into it here eventually. And there was an exodus of the horses to Solomon from out of Egypt. That means that there was an exporting. I have it down in the footnote of the horses. They were exporting from out of Egypt, and they were brought forth by the value of the merchants of the king. So they were purchased by the merchants for the king's purpose. And they ascended and brought from out of Egypt, the merchants, one chariot for 600 pieces of silver, and a horse for 50 and 150 pieces of silver. Now, I have the pieces. You can see it's in italic. It doesn't say it's a shekel or a drachma. What exactly this piece entailed, how big it was, I don't know. So we can only guess, but this is what it was. And thus to all the kings of the Hittites, which were north of Syria, and to the kings of Syria, they brought them forth by their hands. So now the wealth is coming to Solomon. Next comes the building of the house of the Lord, the temple. And we will go into that in the second chapter and follow the kings and what happened. And Hope you'll join us in chapter 2, and God bless.